Well, good evening, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us here tonight. It's a pleasure to be here today. As a non-Indigenous person, it's really important for me to acknowledge the territory that I'm standing on right now. And so joining here 5 years ago, I have the privilege of living in the territory of the people of Treaty 7, the Blackfoot Confederacy, Kainai Piikani, Siksika First Nation, and Amskapi, which is south of the Canadian border, just south of us here in Satina, and then the Iarhe Nakota Nations to the west, Chiniki, Bear Spa, and Good Stony Nations, and Métis Nation District 5 and 6. It's important for me to make that acknowledgement again, recognizing that I have a privilege being able to have my 2 feet firmly planted here today. I want to start here today talking a little bit about who I am and why I'm here, but really more importantly, why we're all here to talk about it and to really start thinking a little bit outside the box and peel back the layers of what is some pretty complicated topics. We're gonna venture beyond the surface today, or at least that's the goal. And I'm not gonna throw up data and facts and figures up on these slides here today because I think there's a lot of information overload, and we'll get to that. Instead, we're gonna get back to the root. We're gonna come back to the roots of where we need to have these important conversations and where we need to go. So I start first, as a researcher, as a teacher, as just a human being, I always start with a question. And the question in the context of water research is really, what do you do when nobody cares? And that's a tough question to ask to an audience full of people who came here tonight to talk about water and who seemingly probably care about water. And I'm not saying that you actively don't care about water, but we do recognize the importance of water, right? Of course we do. We recognize it's part of every living thing that we do. The sessions that we've had about talking exciting research, one child, every child, there is no healthy child without water. When you talk about quantum computing and the benefits and power of quantum research, there is no quantum research without water. There's no food on the table without water. There's nothing without water. And yet we know that, and yet still we sit back. And we sit back usually in a space of overwhelmingness. We are overwhelmed with data and information. It's a flood, it's a drought, it's a drought, it's a flood. There's a lot of water, there's not enough water, there might be too much water, the water's not good, the water might be okay. I don't know what is happening with the water. And the other piece that we're faced with is this overwhelming sense of flood of neglect. And what a flood of neglect is that I've been hit with all of the impacts of years and years of inaction. And inaction implies inaction, but sometimes inaction is just the action of not doing anything. It implies intentionality. It's not always intentional. It just happens to be. Life gets busy. It's hard to put food on the table. The cost of living is expensive. We go through, and 10, 15, 20, 30 years down, we're now faced with what happens when we neglect something, when we neglect things too long. That sense of overwhelmingness can make us feel isolated, but luckily we're all here in good company. But unfortunately, in that company, we often have gotten really comfortable with the notion of collective indifference. And indifference is a hard word. Indifference implies something negative, and it's not meant as a critique. Indifference, from the Latin word indifferentia, really literally means not different. It means that I can give you all this information. I can tell you there's going to be a drought. I can tell you that you're living in an area that's at risk of flood. But your reaction remains the same, not different, not changed. And that's really a really key problem that we have to unpack if we want to talk about how we can do things differently. That collective indifference is really important. So we go back to that original question and we say, okay, what do you do when nobody cares? They want to care, they sort of don't really care though enough to act. So the question becomes different. Then I need to unpack that question. And to do that, I have to recognize that there is an inherent disconnection that exists, a disconnection that is there by design. That disconnection by design is the notion of planned unimportance. Most people are familiar with planned obsolescence, the creation of something that you will not need eventually. When it comes to water management, it's often been planned unimportance. I want it to be so easy for you that you have no idea where your water's coming from, that you have no idea how important and critical it is to your everyday life. That planned unimportance makes it so hard then to innovate. And that planned unimportance, like I said, is by design. And it really has created a space that becomes really challenging to work within. And so then we have to go back again and ask ourselves, okay, what do you do when nobody cares about water? They don't really care enough to act. And on top of that, the system that we all live in was 100% designed to ensure that we are disconnected. And so we have to ask ourselves, how did we get here? How did we get so disconnected from one another, from people, from place? How did this happen? And that requires us to go back in history. And it's not every day that you'll sit in a room and listen to an engineer who talks mostly to people talk about history. So if you're willing to take that risk with me right now, we're going to go a little bit into the history side of this. And I'm going to take you back in time. But most people would say, if you looked around the room and said, okay, where did everything go wrong? A lot of people are going to point to the Industrial Revolution. They're going to say, that's when things went bad. We started post-war population growth, massive development, infrastructure expansion across North America and around the world. That's when things went for a crapper. We started having poor water, poor air quality. Things really went downhill after that. And sure, it would be easy to say that. It's certainly easy for me to blame my parents for the situation that we're currently in right now, or my grandparents, but that would be short-sighted. In order to really unpack where we're at right now, you actually have to go back 2,000 years. And you go back 300 BC to the time of the Romans. And during this time, we have massive development in that context. And we revere these major infrastructure interventions these days, the aqueducts, the Roman aqueducts, beautiful structures, aren't they? They were designed, though, not for harmony with nature, not for reciprocity, not to live in a space where we value nature. They were designed with a sole purpose of total world domination. Now, I know that's harsh. I'm Italian, so I feel it's okay that I can say that. But that's what they were designed for. They were designed to ensure the Romans survived and everybody else literally did not. And so the design of the aqueducts is to get water to sustain Roman people and ensure that everybody else, we don't care about that. At the same time, we can plow through nature and the environment and we don't care what we're going through. People or places we're building. And so you might say to yourself, well, who cares? That was 2,000 years ago. So let's fast forward then. Let's fast forward to the turn of the 20th century and let's put our feet firmly planted in Los Angeles. Los Angeles at the time recognizes we can't grow the way that we want to grow unless we get more water. We need to get more water. And I think someone was wearing a "What Would the Romans Do" shirt at this exact moment. And they said, I know, we'll go 375 kilometers northeast of the city of Los Angeles and we'll drain Owens Valley. And that's exactly what they did. They built a modern day aqueduct 375 kilometers northeast to feed the city of Los Angeles to what is now a booming metropolis. How do you then unpack that? How do you fix a problem that started in such a different place? And certainly maybe people in the room will go, well, that was the States. That was down south. We don't do that. So I'll take you further north and we'll go to the Lower Mainland. And we'll stay in the Lower Mainland at the turn of the 20th century and we'll realize that at that time period, there was development of the area, some fertile ground, some great place to grow food and live. Small problem. There was a giant lake there, Sumas Lake. At that time period, and this is public information in the BC archives, decision was made, you know what, let's move that lake. And in the BC archives, there's a reference to First Nations people at the time being completely thrown off by an approach where you would displace nature in order to have your livelihood. It made no sense. The chief actually said to some of those early day innovators, you know, this doesn't make any sense to us. Why would you move nature in order to make your life work? And if we fast forward to a couple years ago when we had a major infrastructure failure that resulted in the flooding of the Lower Mainland, well, that was just disastrous. But if you look at the pictures, that water just went right back where it wanted to be, right back to Sumas Lake. And yet what did we do? We repaired, we finished it up, we bottled it back up the way that it had always been, and we'll wait. We'll wait until that happens again, because that's our approach. That's the way North American cities have evolved over the last 100 years in particular, is built on the structure. The roots of that tree were built in Roman times with an idea that we don't need to be connected to that water, that we can control and manage it. And so when you ask that question again, you land at going, goodness gracious, this is a lot. This is a lot. This is really overwhelming. How are we going to move forward within this space? It's so challenging. We have to start then to unpack. What we recognize right now is that we've been innovating in the wrong space often. We're innovating at the leaves of the trees when we have to start looking at where the roots of the trees are. And there's a notion in the innovation spectrum is that, there's few people that make changes, and there's a lot of change, and then there's these laggards, right? They're the longest people to get on board with innovation. In reality with water, we're all laggards. We're all ending up on the laggard stage because there's nothing pushing us to change. There's a notion in engineering, I learned it in my first year university, 3 rules of engineering, and I'll spare you 2 of them because you have to pay the first year tuition to get all 3. But I'll give you 1, and that one is you can't push on a rope. And that was taught to me as a way of understanding the difference of compression and tension and structural engineering, and that's probably why I never became a structural engineer, because I didn't think of it that way. I thought, you can't push on a rope, you can't force people to do something they don't want to do. And that's really what we're doing right now, and we saw that certainly this past summer. It really takes a lot for people to change, right? So when the pipe burst, okay, something's wrong, I'm gonna act for a little bit. That second time though, when the water restrictions came in, I didn't see no pipe burst, I'm good, I'm fine. I'm not gonna do anything on water restriction because it's out of sight, out of mind, and easy for me to not think about. And so we have to find a way to rethink about our connection to water. But so long as we're innovating at the leaves of the trees, we're challenged with how we're going to actually make a difference. And so it forces us now to rethink about how we're approaching water. We have to relearn our relationship with water. We have to first unlearn this relationship, this notion of how we've been built up over the years. We have to relearn, we have to renew, we have to redesign, we have to reclaim. We have to reconcile. Reconciliation is a huge part of that because the way in which we live with nature right now goes against tens of thousands of years of lived experience of living in harmony with nature. And right now we're not listening to those that have lived the longest in harmony with nature. So we have to reposition ourselves. And I think that's really the only way we can move forward. So why is an engineer talking about working with people? Because really at the end of the day, everything that we've been engineering and researching and innovating is not focused on the people that matter the most. And it's all of us collectively that have to be part of that change. And so a lot of times we say, we got to start thinking outside the box. We got to start thinking outside the box. It's really hard to think outside the box when you're still in the box. And so we have to start thinking, maybe in the context of a water analogy, we can start thinking beyond the surface. Thank you.